What if AI could finally rebuild the Antikythera Mechanism's missing half? Somewhere at the bottom of the Aegean Sea, a machine sat broken for 1900 years, waiting for someone with the right eyes to find it. When they finally did, it didn't look like a machine at all. It looked like a rock. A lump of green, crusted bronze, the size of a shoebox, hauled up alongside marble statues and glassware from a Roman shipwreck and almost thrown back. Nobody on that boat in 1901 had any idea they were holding the most advanced surviving object from the ancient world. And more than a century later, we still don't have all of it. 2/3 of the original machine is gone forever, dissolved into the seafloor before anyone alive was born. So here's the question I want to sit with today. If artificial intelligence ever gets good enough to rebuild what the sea took, what would it find? Not a guest dressed up as a headline, an honest look at what we actually know, what's genuinely still a mystery, and what a real reconstruction, AI-assisted or otherwise, would have to reckon with. Let's start with the wreck itself, because the story of how this thing was found is almost as strange as the object. In the spring of 1900, a crew of Greek sponge divers took shelter from a storm near a barren island called Antikythera, wedged in the strait between Crete and the Peloponnese. When the weather cleared, one of the divers went down in a heavy canvas suit and a brass helmet to check whether the sponge beds nearby were worth working. He came up rattled, saying he'd seen a pile of corpses on the seabed, bronze limbs reaching out of the sand, horses frozen mid-stride, a hand curled up out of the silt. His captain assumed the nitrogen had gotten to him and went down to check for himself. What they'd actually found was a Roman-era cargo ship that had gone down around the middle of the 1st century BC, loaded with looted Greek art it was hauling back toward Italy. It turned into one of the first serious underwater archaeological excavations in history. Divers spent months bringing up bronze and marble statues that now anchor entire wings of the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, along with jewelry, coins, glassware, and almost as an afterthought, a nondescript, corroded lump that nobody paid much attention to at first. That lump sat around for a while before someone noticed it had split open, and inside was something that made no sense for the year 60 BC, a gear wheel, cut with teeth precise enough that it looked machine-made. Gearing like that wasn't supposed to exist for another 14 centuries. That was the first clue, and it kicked off more than 100 years of people trying to figure out exactly what they were looking at. The device we now call the Antikythera Mechanism turned out to be an astronomical calculating machine, a hand-cranked model of the sky, built from dozens of interlocking bronze gears housed in a wooden case roughly the size of a large book. Turn the crank, and a pointer on the front face would track the position of the sun and moon against the zodiac. A small rotating ball, painted half light and half dark, would show the phase of the moon on any given night. On the back, spiral dials tracked longer cycles, the 19-year Metonic cycle used to reconcile lunar months with the solar year, the 4-year cycle of Greek athletic games including the Olympics, and most strikingly, a dial that predicted eclipses years in advance. Someone in the 1st century BC could turn a crank and know, with real accuracy, when the moon would slip into shadow on a specific night, months, or years in the future. For most of the 20th century, our understanding of this machine came down to one man's extraordinary patience. A British physicist and historian of science spent years in the 1950s and 60s working from X-ray photographs of the fragments, counting gear teeth one by one, and working out the ratios between them, because a gear ratio isn't just a mechanical detail, it's a frozen piece of math. If you know a wheel with 38 teeth is driving a wheel with 127, and you know your ancient astronomy, you can work out exactly what that pairing was built to calculate. His painstaking tooth counting produced the first serious reconstruction of the mechanism, and it reshaped how historians thought about ancient Greek technology almost overnight. But here's the catch that never made it onto most museum placards. That reconstruction was built from roughly 1/3 of the original object. The rest is gone. Missing gears, missing dials, missing pointers, dissolved by nearly 2,000 years of Mediterranean seawater. For decades, the working assumption was that the missing 2/3 probably didn't do much more than duplicate or extend what survived. More calendar functions, more redundancy, nothing that would upend the picture. That assumption was reasonable. It was also never something anyone could actually prove because you cannot count the teeth on a gear that no longer exists. The next real leap didn't come from a bigger magnifying glass. It came from a scanner. In 2005, a research consortium brought an 8-ton, purpose-built X-ray computed tomography system to Athens because the fragments were too fragile and valuable to ship anywhere else. This machine could see through 2,000 years of corrosion the way a hospital CT scanner sees through skin, building up a three-dimensional picture of the bronze layer by layer without touching it. What it found inside the corrosion were thousands of tiny inscribed Greek letters, text that had been sitting on the mechanism the entire time, completely unreadable to the naked eye. Essentially, the machine had its own instruction manual engraved on its plates, and for nearly 2,000 years, nobody could read a word of it. That text turned out to describe functions and indicators that don't survive in the physical fragments, references to the 5 planets known to the Greeks, descriptions of dial functions that go beyond the simple calendar picture. It didn't hand researchers a finished machine. It handed them a set of very specific, very frustrating clues about a machine that was clearly more ambitious than the surviving third suggested, without giving them enough physical evidence to rebuild it outright. This is where the actual cutting edge of Antikythera research sits today, and it's worth being precise about what AI has and hasn't done here, because the honest version is genuinely interesting on its own. In 2021, a team at University College London, led by mechanical engineer Tony Freeth, working with mathematicians and engineers including Adam Wojcik and David Higgin, published a proposed reconstruction of the mechanism's front gearing, the part that would have displayed the 5 known planets alongside the Sun and Moon. Their approach leaned heavily on computational and mathematical modeling, taking the recovered inscriptions, the surviving mounting points, the known gear counts, and the physical constraints of the bronze plates, then systematically working through the combinatorics to find gear trains that could satisfy every constraint simultaneously. It's the kind of brute force, constraint-satisfying search that's much better suited to a computer than to a person with a notepad, and it produced a specific, testable proposal for how the front of the machine might have modeled the retrograde motion of the planets, the way Venus or Mars will appear to drift forward against the stars, slow down, briefly reverse, and then continue on. That looping motion terrified and fascinated ancient skywatchers, and reproducing it mechanically is a serious engineering achievement, even as a hypothesis. That's real, published, peer-reviewed work. It's also, importantly, a proposal, one strong candidate reconstruction among others that different research groups have argued for over the years, not a settled, universally agreed-upon final answer. Some elements of the UCL model have been debated by other specialists in the field, including questions about whether the proposed gear trains would have physically fit inside the case, and whether alternative arrangements might satisfy the same inscriptions just as well. That's normal, healthy science. It's also exactly the kind of nuance that gets flattened into AI rebuilds ancient supercomputer, and the answer will shock you by content that's more interested in your watch time than in what actually happened. So, let's do the honest version of the thought experiment. Suppose a future research effort combines everything we've discussed, the CT-scanned inscriptions, the confirmed gear counts, the physical dimensions of the surviving plates, and feeds all of it into a machine learning system trained specifically to search an enormous space of possible gear arrangements, testing each one against every constraint we have. The inscriptions, the tooth counts, the spacing of mounting holes, the physical limits of what could actually fit inside a wooden case, that size. That's not science fiction. It's a fairly natural extension of the computational approach researchers are already using, just with more powerful search and pattern matching behind it. What might it actually be capable of finding that a human team, working by hand, would struggle to reach? The honest answer is probably a narrower, more confident range of candidate reconstructions for the front planetary gearing, and possibly a more complete account of what that subsidiary dial on the eclipse spiral was doing, because the fragments do show hints of a smaller dial riding along the main eclipse predictor, and the inscriptions do reference the character of an eclipse, not just its timing. Ancient eclipse tables were sometimes concerned with more than just an eclipse will happen. They tracked qualitative details, like whether an eclipse would be visible, how it might appear, tied to omen traditions with deep roots in Babylonian astronomy that the Greeks inherited and mathematized. A more powerful reconstruction tool might help clarify how much of that character of the eclipse information the mechanism was actually built to convey, as opposed to how much is still guesswork stitched onto a genuinely fragmentary text. What it almost certainly would not do is transform a 2,000-year-old astronomical calculator into evidence of some vanished, globe-spanning ancient supercivilization, or prove that the timeline of human technological history is secretly centuries or millennia off. That's the leap a lot of viral scripts make, and it's worth being blunt about why it doesn't hold up. We're not short on context for where this machine came from. We know the broader intellectual world it came out of. Greek astronomers of the Hellenistic period were in active contact with Babylonian observational astronomy, which had already produced centuries of eclipse records and planetary period relationships by the time the Antikythera Mechanism was built. We know Greek mathematicians of the era, people like Hipparchus, were actively developing the geometric models, eccentric circles, epicycles, that this kind of gearing would need to translate into bronze. The mechanism isn't a mysterious artifact with no ancestry. It's the most sophisticated physical survivor of a tradition we can actually trace, built by people whose names we've mostly lost, in a workshop tradition we don't fully understand, but not out of nowhere. That doesn't make it any less remarkable. If anything, it's more remarkable this way because it means the sophistication wasn't a fluke. It was the visible tip of a much larger body of astronomical and mathematical knowledge that mostly didn't survive in physical form. Papyrus rots. Wax tablets get reused. Wooden cases and their written instructions burn or rot along with everything else made of organic material from the ancient world. Bronze corrodes but survives, and in this one case, corrodes slowly enough at the bottom of the sea that 2,000 years later we can still read what's left of it. The Antikythera Mechanism isn't proof that the ancients had secret knowledge we've lost entirely. It's proof that they had a level of applied mathematical astronomy that mostly didn't survive, and this one object is the exception that got through. There's also a genuinely human layer to this story that's easy to lose in the hype, and it's the part one keep coming back to. Whoever built this thing, and we don't know if it was one obsessive craftsman, a workshop, or a longer tradition we've lost every other trace of, had already done the hard intellectual work of modeling planetary motion mathematically. And then, instead of writing that model down somewhere that could be copied and taught, they encoded it directly into gear ratios. 47 teeth here, 53 there, ratios chosen with a precision that only makes sense if someone had already worked out the underlying astronomy and was translating it, tooth by tooth, into a physical mechanism a person with no mathematical training could operate by turning a crank. That's not just an astronomical instrument. That's an attempt to make expert knowledge usable by someone who isn't the expert, to compress years of calculation into an object simple enough that a ship's captain or a merchant could carry real predictive power around in a wooden box. And then it sank, and the tradition that produced it seems to have mostly gone with it. We don't see anything comparable again in the historical or archaeological record for well over 1,000 years, until European clockmakers in the medieval period start building complex geared astronomical clocks, apparently without any direct knowledge that something like this had already been done. That gap is real, it's documented, and historians genuinely argue about how to explain it, whether this was a rare, isolated achievement by an exceptional individual or workshop that simply didn't get passed on, or whether devices like it were more common than we think, and this is just the one that happened to survive a shipwreck instead of a scrapyard. So here's where I actually land on the question I open with. Could AI help rebuild more of what the sea took from this machine? Genuinely, yes, in the same way computational modeling already has, just with more horsepower behind the search. Could it hand us a complete, definitive picture of the missing two-thirds with total certainty? Almost certainly not, because the fundamental problem isn't computing power, it's that the physical evidence itself is gone. No algorithm can count the teeth on a gear that dissolved into the Mediterranean seafloor before your great-great-grandparents were born. What AI-assisted reconstruction can do is narrow the space of plausible answers, test them against every scrap of evidence we do have far faster and more rigorously than a human team working by hand, and maybe, get us closer to knowing exactly how far ahead of their time whoever built this thing really was. We already know it was far. The only real question left is how far, and whether we're brave enough to sit with an honest, uncertain answer instead of reaching for the most dramatic one available. What do you think actually happened to the tradition that built this thing? A one-off genius lost to history, or a whole lost body of knowledge we've barely scratched the surface of? Let me know down in the comments.